It began as a quiet procedural rumor inside Buckingham Palace, an appointment that was never meant to bypass protocol, yet somehow did. When word spread that Princess Catherine had been named special advisor directly to King Charles III, skipping Queen Camilla's entire office structure, courtiers froze. Because nothing like this had happened in years. And the reaction from Queen Camilla's inner circle suggested this was not an administrative change, it was a power shift. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Inside the palace, the earliest signals were not loud declarations or formal notices, but fragmented briefings moving through restricted channels, carefully worded, deliberately restrained, and yet impossible to misread by those who understood how the machinery of the monarchy truly worked. The directive, reportedly issued under the private instruction of King Charles III, placed Catherine, Princess of Wales, into a role described only as special advisor to the king. A phrase that carried weight precisely because it was undefined in the usual chain of command. What unsettled the household was not Catherine's presence in advisory matters. She had long been seen as a stabilizing figure, but the fact that the appointment bypassed Queen Camilla's established domestic advisory structure entirely. In a system built on layers of consultation, discretion, and controlled access, such a move was not just unusual, it was structurally disruptive. Senior aides, according to multiple palace whispers, reportedly struggled to identify where new reports should be directed, and for the first time in recent memory, silence replaced coordination. Within Queen Camilla's household office, early reactions were described as controlled but tense. Conversations were shortened, meetings were quietly delayed, and in the corridors closest to her private secretariat, there was an unusual absence of commentary, an institutional silence that often signals more than open disagreement. Those familiar with palace rhythms noted that silence was rarely neutral. It was either strategic restraint or the calm before procedural correction. Prince William was reportedly informed before the wider circulation of the notice, a detail that only deepened the sense of deliberate timing behind the decision. His proximity to Catherine's evolving role added another layer of interpretation, suggesting that this was not an isolated appointment, but part of a broader recalibration within the king's inner advisory orbit. Yet even with that context, courtiers described the atmosphere as uncertain, as though the usual map of influence had been quietly redrawn overnight. And still, no public clarification emerged, no correction, no reaffirmation of hierarchy, only the slow realization that something fundamental had shifted not through confrontation, but through omission. Different interpretations of the moment began circulating among insiders, some framing it as administrative efficiency, others as a subtle rebalancing of trust at the highest level of the monarchy. But the real shock was not the appointment itself, it was the question of why King Charles chose Catherine over the Queen's established authority structure. Inside Buckingham Palace, nothing is ever just a title. Every role is a layer of influence, and every layer protects someone's authority. The office of Queen Camilla had long been considered a stabilizing force around King Charles III, but beneath that stability lay competing advisory networks, old loyalties, and carefully balanced power corridors. Catherine's quiet rise had been observed for years, but never seen as a direct challenge until now. Inside this carefully engineered system, the monarchy under Charles III functioned less like a single hierarchy and more like a living structure of overlapping influence. Decisions rarely moved in straight lines. Instead, they passed through private secretaries, household offices, senior advisors, and trusted intermediaries, each layer acting as both filter and gatekeeper. At the center of this delicate architecture stood Queen Camilla's household office, a structure built not only on loyalty to the Queen, but also on her proximity to the King's personal schedule, private briefings, and informal consultations. For years, This office had been described as a stabilizing anchor, an administrative force that ensured continuity within the unpredictable rhythm of royal duties. It managed access, shaped tone, and quietly filtered which voices reached the king at critical moments. In many ways, it functioned as the monarchy's internal control room, where influence was not announced but carefully distributed. Nothing significant was expected to bypass it, and historically, very little ever did. Yet over time, another current began forming alongside it. After 2024, the presence of Catherine, Princess of Wales, became increasingly visible not through formal authority, but through consistent public trust and private reliability. Her role in public engagements, charity leadership, and institutional representation gave her something rare within the modern monarchy: credibility that extended beyond ceremonial duty. Courtiers began to notice that her input, though informal, was increasingly sought in discussions involving long-term stability and public perception. This shift did not happen abruptly. It developed through subtle patterns, brief consultations with Prince William, quiet involvement in strategic conversations, and a growing reliance on her judgment during moments when the institution needed calm rather than ceremony. Within internal discussions, she was often described as a balancing presence, someone who could translate tradition into modern relevance without destabilizing either. At the same time, a quiet tension began forming between two philosophical camps within the palace structure. On one side stood the traditional household model, where authority flowed through established offices and long-standing protocols. On the other side emerged what some insiders loosely referred to as the modernization camp, those who believed influence should be guided more by public trust, adaptability, and direct alignment with the future direction of the monarchy. Catherine, intentionally or not, became the symbolic intersection of both. To traditionalists, she represented continuity, disciplined, measured, and deeply respectful of hierarchy. To reform-minded advisors, she represented efficiency, someone who could connect the monarchy to its evolving public role without friction or excess bureaucracy. This dual perception made her position uniquely powerful, even without formal elevation. Meanwhile, Prince William's increasing proximity to strategic decision-making added another dimension to this evolving structure. His alignment with Catherine in matters of public engagement and institutional clarity reinforced the idea that their combined influence was becoming a stabilizing core within the royal framework. Still, none of this was officially acknowledged as a shift in authority. It existed in behavior, not declaration. Queen Camilla's office, however, remained central in the formal structure, continuing to manage daily coordination and internal flow. Yet even within its established boundaries, subtle friction began to surface. Not confrontation, but hesitation. Not rejection, but recalibration. Advisors began to sense that the old assumption that all meaningful influence must pass through a single household channel was no longer absolute. And beneath this carefully balanced structure, a decision had already been made that would quietly break the established chain of command. Reports suggest the shift did not happen publicly, it happened in silence. A private directive, allegedly routed through the king's personal correspondence channel, placed Catherine directly in advisory contact with Charles. That single administrative step bypassed Queen Camilla's office entirely. Courtiers describe it not as a dismissal, but as an omission, one that effectively erased an entire layer of influence without a formal confrontation. The mechanism behind this change, according to palace-adjacent interpretations, was not loud or ceremonial. It was procedural, almost invisible to anyone outside the narrow circle that handles the king's most private communications. Within the governance structure of Charles III, certain decisions can travel through restricted correspondence channels that do not pass through the usual household filters. It is within these rare pathways that influence can be redirected without public acknowledgement. And it is here insiders suggest that the appointment quietly took shape. What makes this development so unusual is not simply the elevation of Catherine, Princess of Wales, into a special advisor role, but the manner in which it was structured. Her advisory link to the king reportedly bypassed the entire domestic chain overseen by Queen Camilla's office. In a system where consultation layers are designed to prevent precisely this kind of direct bypass, the omission of one entire administrative tier was seen as more significant than the appointment itself. Senior aides were reportedly caught off guard when internal reporting lines began to reflect this new structure. Instead of the usual cascading flow private secretary to household office to advisory coordination, the communication path appeared to shorten dramatically. Catherine's role, described in internal phrasing as strategic advisory stabilization, was inserted directly into the king's decision orbit, creating an unusually direct line of influence that many had not anticipated. Within palace corridors, the term procedural invisibility tactic began circulating among those trying to explain what had occurred without attributing intent. It did not suggest sabotage or confrontation, but rather a quiet restructuring achieved through omission rather than declaration. Nothing was removed openly. Nothing was formally challenged. Yet the end result was unmistakable. A layer of authority had been silently stepped over. As early briefings filtered outward, senior household staff began recalibrating their understanding of where decisions would now originate. Some described confusion, others described cautious adaptation. But beneath both reactions lay the same realization that the established map of communication had changed shape without warning. In environments where clarity is everything, even a small shift in reporting structure can feel like a seismic disturbance. Within Queen Camilla's broader advisory network, the first response was not public, but internal. Quiet reassessments began taking place: who now receives what, which briefings remain relevant, and where influence still holds weight. It was not a confrontation, but it was unmistakably a recalibration. The absence of formal explanation only deepened the uncertainty, because in palace logic, silence often carries more authority than statements. And as this new structure began to settle into place, one fact became impossible to ignore: the bypass had not been announced. It had been discovered, and its discovery would ignite a reaction not from the king himself, but from those who believed the structure they served had just been fundamentally undermined. Within hours of the appointment circulating, senior household figures began what insiders quietly describe as an institutional audit of authority. The machinery of palace governance, often invisible to the public, began recalibrating itself. The question was no longer whether Catherine had been appointed. The question was whether Queen Camilla's office had just been structurally outmaneuvered without consent. What unfolded inside the administration of Charles III was not immediate chaos, but controlled recalculation. The royal household is built on precision. Every advisory line, every briefing channel, every reporting structure exists for a reason. So when the appointment of Catherine, Princess of Wales, began circulating through internal channels, it did not trigger public reaction first. It triggered procedural verification. Who authorized it? Who was informed? And most importantly, who was excluded? Almost immediately, Queen Camilla's office sought clarification through private secretaries, initiating a quiet but urgent review of the advisory chain. The tone, according to insiders, was not confrontational, but unmistakably firm. In an institution where hierarchy is not just tradition, but operational necessity, even the suggestion of a bypass is treated as a structural anomaly. The absence of prior consultation became the central concern, overshadowing the appointment itself. At the same time, Catherine maintained complete silence. No clarification, no reinforcement, no public framing of the role. That silence, however, was not interpreted as absence. Within palace logic, silence often carries more weight than explanation, and here it created space for interpretation to multiply in every direction. Some viewed it as discipline, others viewed it as calculated restraint. Either way, it intensified the uncertainty rather than easing it. Prince William, according to multiple palace-adjacent accounts, was reportedly aligned with the need for procedural clarity. His position did not challenge the king's authority, but it emphasized the importance of structural coherence within the institution. In practical terms, this meant ensuring that any advisory evolution around Catherine did not destabilize the established hierarchy, but instead integrated into it with clarity and continuity. Meanwhile, administrative teams began conducting detailed checks on reporting protocols. These were not symbolic reviews. They were operational audits, mapping exactly how information flowed, where it now originated, and whether existing pathways still reflected reality. It was during this phase that chain of command ambiguity was formally flagged by senior aides, a phrase that captured the unease without escalating it into open conflict. Behind these procedural movements lay an unspoken factor that shaped nearly every conversation: the health condition of Charles III. Insiders repeatedly referenced urgency not as pressure but as context. Decisions that might once have taken months were now being interpreted through a lens of immediacy, where stability was prioritized over traditional pacing. This urgency, however, also increased sensitivity to any structural deviation, no matter how small it appeared on paper. And so the institution found itself in a delicate state, trying to stabilize a system that had not yet fully acknowledged whether it had changed. Every office continued functioning, yet every office was now watching the others more closely than before. The machinery was still running, but it was no longer entirely certain who had adjusted the gears. But as the institution tried to stabilize itself, another force quietly entered the equation, one rooted not in disruption, but in enforcement of order. Queen Camilla's reaction, according to palace observers, was not loud, it was structural. Meetings were rescheduled, briefings were tightened, and internal communications became highly restricted. Rather than confronting the appointment directly, her office began reinforcing its operational perimeter, attempting to reassert relevance in a system that appeared to have quietly shifted away from her authority. Within the administrative framework of Charles III, reactions rarely take the form of public confrontation. They manifest instead as adjustments in procedure, access, and rhythm. Following the emergence of Catherine's advisory role, Queen Camilla's household structure began tightening its internal communication protocols with immediate effect. Sensitive briefings were rerouted. Select advisory discussions were restricted to smaller, more controlled circles. It was not a withdrawal, it was a consolidation, an attempt to hold influence through discipline rather than expansion. At the same time, subtle but significant personnel adjustments began to appear within Camilla's orbit. Certain advisors were reassigned, not dismissed, but relocated into different operational areas of the household. These changes, while officially described as routine restructuring, were interpreted by insiders as a form of internal stabilization, an effort to reinforce the core of her advisory network at a moment when external pressures were increasing. What made this phase particularly tense was the absence of direct confrontation. Instead of open resistance to Catherine, Princess of Wales, there emerged what courtiers referred to as a strategic silence phase. Communications became more selective, responses more measured, and internal dialogue more cautious. Silence, in this context, was not passivity, it was control. A way of maintaining authority without escalating conflict. Outside the formal structure, media speculation began to widen the narrative, drawing in familiar names such as Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, even though palace insiders repeatedly emphasized their lack of direct involvement in this specific development. Still, their presence in public discourse added an additional layer of complexity, blurring the boundaries between internal restructuring and external interpretation. In such environments, perception often becomes as influential as reality itself. Meanwhile, Charles III remained physically distant from much of the administrative turbulence, his attention divided by ongoing health management and reduced direct engagement in daily household coordination. This absence did not indicate disengagement, but it did create space that different advisory blocks attempted to fill in competing ways. In that vacuum, even minor procedural shifts carried amplified significance. As Camilla's office reinforced its internal perimeter, the broader tension within the monarchy began to sharpen into a more defined divide. On one side stood the traditional advisory structure built on established hierarchy and controlled access. On the other, a more adaptive and evolving network of influence was forming around Catherine's increasing advisory presence, supported quietly by figures aligned with efficiency and continuity. What emerged was not an open conflict, but a structural tension, two approaches to influence operating within the same institution, each attempting to define stability on its own terms. And yet, instead of converging, the distance between them only widened with each procedural adjustment, each tightened protocol, each silent recalibration of authority. Yet the more Camilla's office reinforced its position, the more the king's inner circle appeared to solidify around a different center of trust. King Charles III, already navigating health pressures and institutional expectations, now faced an uncomfortable reality. Two parallel advisory influences operating within his immediate environment, one rooted in established royal household structure, and another emerging through Catherine's increasing role as a stabilizing public and private figure. Inside the operational core of Charles III, the pressure was no longer simply about governance, it was about balance. Every decision carried weight, not just for the present functioning of the monarchy, but for its long-term stability. On one side stood the traditional advisory framework, anchored in Queen Camilla's established household structure, built over years of careful procedural authority and internal coordination. On the other side, a quieter but increasingly influential presence had formed around Catherine, Princess of Wales, whose role had evolved into something more than public representation. It had become a point of continuity between institution and public trust. As the king managed ongoing health pressures, his capacity for constant administrative oversight naturally became more limited, and within that limitation, advisory influence began to matter even more. Decisions were no longer shaped by a single clear channel, but by overlapping streams of counsel that sometimes aligned and sometimes diverged. What had once been a tightly controlled hierarchy now resembled a dual system of influence, where both structure and adaptability competed for relevance. Within this environment, Catherine's growing presence alongside Prince William began to be viewed not as an external development, but as an internal stabilizing force. Their coordination in public duty, charitable engagement, and institutional messaging created a sense of continuity that resonated beyond ceremonial expectations. Insiders noted that in moments where clarity was required, this pairing often represented consistency and anchor in a shifting environment where certainty had become increasingly rare. At the same time, Queen Camilla's established authority structure found itself under increasing procedural pressure, not through direct challenge, but through redistribution of attention and access. Her household remained fully functional, still central to daily royal operations, yet the perception of influence began to shift subtly as alternative advisory pathways gained visibility within internal discussions. The tension was not overt, but it was persistent, emerging in how decisions were framed, who was consulted first, and which voices carried interpretive weight. Within palace advisory circles, internal debate intensified over the long-term stability strategy of the monarchy. Some argued that preserving traditional household structures was essential to institutional integrity. Others suggested that evolving advisory patterns reflected a necessary adaptation to modern expectations and public accountability. This division did not fracture the system, but it created what insiders increasingly referred to as a dual-influence tension model, where authority existed simultaneously in parallel tracks rather than a single unified chain. What made this moment particularly delicate was that neither influence was explicitly overriding the other. Instead, both were operating within the same institutional space, responding to the same king, but through different interpretive frameworks. The result was not conflict in the traditional sense, but an ongoing recalibration of trust who the king listened to, and in what context that listening carried the most weight. And as this internal divide deepened, the institution began moving toward a resolution that no single office could fully control. Without formal announcement, a new advisory rhythm began to emerge around King Charles III, one that subtly prioritized efficiency over tradition. Catherine's advisory role, though unofficially titled in some internal notes, became increasingly central to decision flow. Meanwhile, Queen Camilla's office found itself managing influence rather than directing it. Within the evolving structure surrounding Charles III, change did not arrive as a single declaration. It arrived as pattern. Meetings that once flowed through multiple household layers began to shorten. Consultations that previously required formal routing through established offices were increasingly shaped by a more direct exchange of ideas. In that shift, the presence of Catherine, Princess of Wales, began to carry a different kind of weight, not ceremonial, not symbolic, but operational. Her integration into key advisory discussions was described by insiders not as a sudden elevation, but as a gradual normalization. Over time, her input became less exceptional and more expected. Where once her presence in strategic conversations was situational, it now appeared as a consistent point of reference in discussions involving stability, public alignment, and institutional clarity. This was not framed as a replacement of existing structures, but as an additional layer that increasingly influenced direction. At the same time, Queen Camilla's household structure experienced a subtle but undeniable transformation in function. Rather than acting as the primary driver of advisory flow, it began to operate more as a stabilizing and coordinating body focused heavily on ceremonial continuity and domestic diplomatic responsibilities. The shift was not publicly acknowledged, but within internal rhythms, its effect was visible. Influence was no longer concentrated in a single channel, but distributed across multiple points of contact. Prince William's role in this evolving structure further reinforced the push towards streamlined decision-making. His alignment with Catherine in matters of efficiency and institutional clarity added momentum to the emerging preference for faster, less layered consultation. Together, their combined presence represented a model of coordination that contrasted with the slower, more traditional advisory pathways that had defined earlier phases of the reign. Throughout this period, palace operations remained fully functional, but their internal tempo changed. The emphasis on palace efficiency, especially in light of King Charles III's ongoing health considerations, became a recurring theme across briefings. Decisions that once allowed for extended deliberation were now framed within tighter windows of necessity. This was not portrayed as urgency for its own sake, but as adaptation to circumstance and institution adjusting its rhythm to match the realities at its center. What emerged from this adjustment was not confrontation, but internal adaptation. There were no public clashes, no formal disputes, no visible fractures in protocol. Instead, courtiers described what they quietly termed a soft restructuring phase, where influence shifted not through conflict, but through repetition, preference, and trust gradually redistributed over time. And yet, beneath this calm procedural surface, something more profound was taking shape. Because in the monarchy, structural change is never just about function. It is about meaning. And the most significant change was not administrative, it was symbolic. And symbolism inside the monarchy always signals permanence. What began as a quiet appointment had evolved into a structural redefinition of influence at the heart of the monarchy. Catherine's elevation as special advisor was no longer seen as an isolated decision, it was interpreted as a signal of where the future center of royal stability now lies. Within the evolving architecture surrounding Charles III, nothing shifted loudly, yet everything shifted decisively. The monarchy does not announce its transformations, it absorbs them, normalizes them, and only later reveals their permanence through behavior. In this case, the growing centrality of Catherine, Princess of Wales, had reached a point where her presence was no longer interpreted as supplementary. It had become foundational to how stability itself was being defined. Catherine's position as a stabilizing figure did not emerge through confrontation or replacement, but through accumulation. Each advisory moment, each quiet consultation, each instance of measured judgment added weight to a role that was never formally expanded, but increasingly recognized in practice. Within internal circles, she was no longer discussed as an adjacent influence. She was spoken of as a reference point, a steady axis around which other decisions increasingly aligned. At the same time, Queen Camilla's household office did not disappear from the structure. It remained operational, functional, and essential in ceremonial and domestic diplomacy. However, its role within advisory dominance began to shift. Influence that once flowed through a singular, concentrated channel now moved across a broader and more distributed system. This was not removal. It was rebalancing. And in the monarchy, rebalancing often carries more consequence than elimination. Prince William's presence within this evolving framework reinforced what insiders quietly described as a long-term alignment. Together with Catherine, he formed what many now interpreted as the emerging core of future governance, not through declaration, but through consistency, trust, and coordinated decision-making under pressure. Their combined influence represented continuity in motion, a living projection of what the institution might become in the years ahead. Meanwhile, Charles III maintained final authority, but the nature of delegation had clearly evolved. Decisions were still his, but the pathways leading to those decisions had become more selective, more refined, and more consciously filtered through trusted points of stability. This did not diminish authority, it concentrated it, narrowing the channels through which complexity was allowed to pass. Across the institution, the language of continuity began to replace the language of immediate management. Advisors increasingly referenced long-term alignment, structural coherence, and post-transition planning. It was within this context that insiders began using a phrase that carried quiet weight: post-transition advisory alignment phase. Not as a formal title, but as a way of describing an institution subtly orienting itself toward the future while still functioning firmly in the present. And as this phase deepened, the monarchy did what it has always done best: it adapted without announcing, it shifted without collapsing, and it redefined influence without removing it. What had once been a collection of parallel advisory streams was now converging toward a more recognizable center of stability, shaped by trust as much as tradition. And in the silence of Buckingham Palace's long corridors, one truth becomes unavoidable. The balance of influence has not been removed, it has simply been rewritten. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.